Sometimes. The most terrifying stories come from the most unexpected places. A simple road trip with friends. A quiet night shift that reveals unsettling secrets in the shadows. What would you do when reality twists into something more sinister? When the familiar becomes the unknown? Welcome to Hell Stories, where every tale is a journey into fear. Join us as we unravel two chilling accounts, each more unsettling than the last. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, one last hurrah before graduation and the real world set in. There were three of us, me, Jay, and Mike. We'd been best friends since we were kids, the kind of bond that sticks with you no matter what. College had started pulling us in different directions, but before life fully took over, we figured we had time for one last adventure. We had no destination in mind. Just Mike's old, beat-up Subaru, some snacks, and the open road ahead. Mike always drove. He was the calmest of the group. Jay, on the other hand, was the impulsive one, always up for anything, no matter how crazy. I was more laid back, just happy to be along for the ride. A few hours into the trip, we left behind any sign of civilization. The roads got emptier, the towns we passed were barely more than a few buildings, and the land stretched out in a flat, eerie emptiness. Jay kept joking that this was where people go missing, the kind of place where serial killers bury the bodies. At the time, we laughed. But that laughter faded as the sun dipped lower and the roads stretched on. The excitement of the trip started to wear off, and boredom set in. We hadn't seen a gas station or a motel for miles. Mike suggested we push through to the next town, about 50 miles ahead, and we all agreed. That's when we saw it. A faded billboard on the side of the road. Mr. McGuire's House of Oddities, 2 miles ahead. Jay perked up. House of Oddities? That sounds awesome. Like one of those Ripley's Believe It or Not places. I wasn't as enthusiastic, but I figured, why not? It's what we were out here for, right? Some weird adventure. We followed the sign down a small dirt road, and eventually, we saw the place. It wasn't much, a rundown, squat building that looked like an old farmhouse. The paint was peeling, and the yard was filled with strange metal sculptures, twisted into shapes that made no sense. A weathered wooden sign above the door read, Mr. McGuire's House of Oddities. The place gave me the creeps instantly, but Jay just laughed. This looks like the start of a horror movie, he joked. Mike parked, and we got out, approaching the door. As I opened it, a small bell rang, and we were greeted by a strange little man, Mr. McGuire himself. He was short, with wild silver hair and eyes that seemed too wide. His grin was unnerving, stretched almost unnaturally across his face. He wore a faded vest over a yellow shirt, the whole look screaming, "Carnival Barker who's seen better days." Visitors!" he exclaimed, his voice high-pitched and almost too cheerful. We exchanged glances, trying not to laugh at how bizarre this guy was. But something about the way he moved, almost dancing around the room, was unsettling. Still, we followed him inside. The place was dimly lit, with a musty smell that hit me immediately. Shelves lined the walls, filled with all kinds of strange items. Bones, weird dolls, jars of murky liquid. McGuire flitted around, pointing out his collection with manic glee. "This here is the skull of a two-headed calf born in 1912, he chirped. "And over here, the hand of a mummified sorcerer." Jay leaned over to me and whispered, "This dude is nuts." "Yeah," I muttered back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was wrong. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, and there was a faint, sour smell beneath the mustiness. Then McGuire pointed to a jar on the shelf. "And here, the preserved heart of a witch." still beating to this day. I stared at the jar. The dark, shriveled lump inside was pulsing, faintly, but undeniably beating. Mike, who had been quiet up until now, stepped forward. "How do you do that? It's got to be a trick, right?" McGuire just smiled wider. "Oh, there are many tricks here, my boy. Many secrets." Mike nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Jay, though, was already bored. "Cool stuff, man. What else you got?" McGuire's grin. He led us down narrow hallways lined with grotesque taxidermy, creatures that looked stitched together from nightmares. A fox with human eyes, a snake with the head of a cat. Jay kept making jokes, but I could tell even he was starting to get freaked out. I realized something after a few minutes. Mike wasn't with us anymore. "Where's Mike?" I asked, looking around. Jay frowned. "I don't know. He was right behind us." McGuire's grin didn't falter. "Oh, don't worry. He must have wandered off. Happens all the time. People get lost in the wonders of this place." "Yeah, but—" I started, but McGuire was already leading Jay deeper into the maze of hallways. I turned back, calling Mike's name. No response. Micah twisted with unease. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. I made my way back through the narrow halls, passing the grotesque displays again, but Mike was nowhere. I found myself back in the room with the jar. The heart wasn't beating anymore. Panic rose in my chest. I bolted back to where Jay and McGuire were, now in some kind of workshop. Jay was staring at something on a table, a human skull, fresh, with bits of flesh still clinging to it. "Jay, we need to go," I said, grabbing his arm. He didn't move, just stared at the skull with wide eyes. "We need to go now," I repeated, and finally, he snapped out of it. We turned to leave, but McGuire was blocking the doorway, his grin wider than ever. "Oh, you can't leave yet, boys," he said, his voice sickly sweet. "The tour's not over." "What did you do with Mike?" I demanded. McGuire's smile faltered for just a second. "Oh, he's around. Everyone finds their place here eventually." I didn't wait for him to say more. I shoved past him, dragging Jay with me, running through the twisting hallways. Every door we tried was locked, every window barred. The walls seemed to close in on us, the air getting thicker, harder to breathe. Finally, we saw the exit, the door we'd come through. I threw myself at it, and it opened. We burst outside, gasping for air, running straight for the car. The house loomed behind us, its twisted sculptures even more menacing in the moonlight. McGuire stood in the doorway, watching us, that twisted grin still on his face. We collapsed when we reached the car, but we were out of luck. Mike had the keys. We ran down the road until a passing truck stopped to give us a ride. We never saw Mike again. When we reported the incident to the police, the museum was gone. Not abandoned, gone. Like it had never been there at all. No trace of McGuire, no trace of Mike. I know where Mike is, though. I'll never forget. In a secluded industrial complex surrounded by dense woods, I settled into my role as the operator and shift manager of a chemical waste incineration plant. Just 2 years prior, I had escaped a workplace where my crew and I nearly lost our lives due to negligence. The management had brushed it off with a casual, "You nearly died, so let's try to avoid it in the future," without implementing any real safety measures. I was grateful for the calm of my new environment, where the air was less tainted by fear. But whispers floated through the break room, tales of weird occurrences. Coworkers spoke of hearing footsteps and catching glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in corners. They attributed it to the fumes from our neighboring department, which, as it turned out, could induce hallucinations at high concentrations. Old pipes, over 50 years in service, were the culprits. Management had decided to ignore necessary repairs, leaving us vulnerable. One fateful night shift, my coworker called in sick, leaving me alone. I was unfazed. After all, the routine was predictable. I made my first inspection tour, and everything seemed normal. But when I descended into the basement to check the sensors, a creak echoed from behind me. Footsteps clattered down the metal stairs, heavy, like the footsteps of someone weighing over 370 pounds. I spun around, but no one was there. Convinced it was merely the fumes playing tricks on my mind, I continued my rounds, even spotting a shadow darting out of sight. I shrugged it off. By the time I returned to the control room, I switched on the AC to dissipate any lingering vapors. Hours later, I embarked on my second inspection. As I descended the stairs again, I was met by that same eerie sound, footsteps, closer this time. They transformed into a sprint. Panic set in. I glimpsed a shadow just before it vanished around the corner. Heart racing, I finished gathering data and hurried back upstairs. But the sound intensified. Now, I was pursued from both behind and above. I bolted up the stairs, glancing back to see a massive shadow lingering halfway down. I rushed into the control room, shutting the door behind me, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I remembered the AC. I had ensured there were no fumes. Yet the shadows and footsteps remained, solidifying a fear that gripped me. As I stood there, I heard soft footsteps outside the door. My instinct screamed to stay put. I decided against being the hero that night, opting to wait for the morning shift. When the next shift arrived, I recounted my harrowing experience, only to be met with laughter. "Probably just a malfunctioning AC," they suggested. I chuckled along, but doubt lingered in my mind. On my first day back, I shared the tale again, but this time my coworkers weren't amused. The neighboring department had been inactive that night. None of their production lines were running. There couldn't have been any fumes to cause hallucinations. What I had witnessed was real. My experiences in that basement, footsteps, shadows, were not figments of my imagination. My coworkers exchanged worried glances. It was then that the gravity of the situation sank in. Our manager filed a report to higher-ups, sparking an investigation into the mysterious disturbances. They sought a logical explanation for the sounds and shadows that haunted the basement. 2 weeks passed without answers. Now, plans were underway to repair the old pipes and install cameras and sensors. As I prepared for another night shift, a chill crawled up my spine. Whatever lurked in that basement had yet to reveal itself fully. Each creak and shadow now felt like a lingering presence, a reminder that some horrors might be more real than we cared to admit. And as the night deepened, I could only wonder, what would the cameras capture in the shadows of the incineration plant?